Okay, so now we are going to turn our attention to Book 5 of Plato's Republic. So remember that we were discussing what exactly the just city is, and Socrates told us that we need to think about the just city in terms of the guardians that are going to be responsible for maintaining the safety of the just city, right? And remember that previously we discussed how at a very young age, the certain children will be taken from their parents in order to train them to be the guardians. And what this introduces is a classification of different types of people. We're given what's called the myth of the metals, which is this idea that certain people are born with certain metals, certain sort of characteristics or features that allow us to classify those people in certain ways. And it's according to that classification that we will separate the children at birth, right? So at a young age, each person will be separated from their parents and trained according to the type of person, the classification that they are identified as. And this is encouraged and promoted through the myth of the metals. And it is based upon this myth of the metals that we get the idea that justice is the non-mixing of the metals or the non-mixing of the classes. Another way of putting this is justice, according to this schema, is everybody doing what is their role, doing their job, doing what it is that their nature specifies. And importantly, not mixing one class with another class or one metal with another metal. Socrates thinks that this is what leads to injustice, is when you have the mixing of the metals or the mixing of the classes. Another way of putting that is when somebody of one class is giving the role or the responsibilities of another class, that's what leads to injustice or harm or problems in society. And so it's in that regard then that we can think of justice as acting in accordance with the type of person you are, acting in such a way that is in accordance with the way you are designed, or what kind of person you are, with your characteristics, your nature. And if that's right, then we can think of justice as harmony. It's harmony between the metals, harmony between the classes, harmony between people of one characteristic and another class of people with a different characteristic. And once again, we need to remember that Socrates is now thinking about the idealized just society, right? This is not an actual society that ever exists. In fact, presumably, it's not one that ever could exist. Of course, Socrates disagrees with that. But it's an idealization. It's sort of like an abstract ideal, something that we should work towards, but something that we can never really quite obtain. So the next question I want to consider is, what exactly are the three different parts of the city? On the one hand, we have the guardian class. These are the philosophers who are trained to govern the city. Then we have the auxiliary class. These are soldiers who are trained to protect the city. And then finally, we have the producing class. And these are the artisans and craftspeople, people that work in a particular trade, a particular skill, like nowadays we might think of someone like a plumber or a mechanic or a doctor, right? These are people with a specific set of skills, and their job is to learn how to perfect that skill, and that's their role in the city, that's their job. So these are the three different parts of the city, and each person will be identified at a young age and separated from their parents and then trained according to the role that they have, the type of person, that whatever metal has been associated with their character. And again, this is supposed to be promoted by the myth of the metals. The idea is supposed to be that justice, a just city, is one where the right people are doing the right things. They're doing their role, right? The philosopher kings are the ones that are supposed to govern. The soldiers are supposed to protect the city, and the producers are supposed to, do whatever they do, like plumbing or mechanics or what have you. And it's when the wrong people are doing the wrong jobs, right? When a mechanic tries to be a governor, or when a soldier tries to rule the city, that's when we have problems. That's when we have discord and disharmony. Now, it's at this point that Glaucon asks Socrates to say more about the guardians. How exactly are we supposed to understand the guardian class? So, on the one hand, the guardians will own everything in common. So, that's a way of saying that there will be no private property amongst the guardians. Also, this includes women and children, right? So, there will be no marriages and no children will belong to any particular parent. Again, they'll be taken from their parents and trained how to be a philosopher king from an early age, and mathematics and the forms. And we'll say more about that here in a minute. Right? But the idea here is that everything will be owned in common, right? A kind of communism, if you will. There'll be no private property. And interestingly, Socrates thinks that women can be philosopher kings too, right? It's not exclusive for the men. And this raises a very interesting question about what exactly a family is. How should we understand the notion of a family? Well, the family is supposed to be an idealization, right? It's a new sort of family in an idealized society. And this is a very radical approach, one that was unheard of at that time. In fact, Glaucon complains, right? And you can imagine how somebody might complain about a number of the different issues involved in this sort of idealized society. In fact, Glaucon thinks that the situation just simply isn't possible. Of course, Socrates thinks it is possible, but it certainly looks like it's not very practical. You can imagine how certain people, whether that be in one class or another class, could complain because nobody wants their children to be taken away from them. Nobody wants their family to be broken down or to lose their property. Of course, Socrates says, yeah, that might be a harm to a particular individual, but we're not interested in what's good for an individual. Socrates is putting all of the focus on what's best for the whole city, for the whole community, not just some individual in the community, not some particular family. Rather, it's the whole city that should be understood as an idealized family. It's the whole city that should be benefited from the individual members, not one particular class or individual as opposed to another. Right? So it's important to recognize that Socrates continues to remind them that we're concerned with an idealized society, not any particular society that actually exists. But why should we think that the guardians are fit to rule? What exactly is it about the guardians that makes it the case that they have the legitimate right or authority to rule over the rest of the citizens? That's the question that I want to turn to now. So Socrates says that those who want to rule should not rule. You can kind of think about how this might work in today's contemporary political situation, right? Often it's the case that the people who end up running for office do so in order to gain power, to gain authority, right? They want that kind of power. They want that sort of authority. It's very rarely the case that anybody ever runs for president of the United States who doesn't want to be president. In fact, that's a pretty standard question that's asked. Why do you want to be president? Right? Well, Plato and Socrates argued that those people who want to be president, those who want to rule, shouldn't. They are the wrong people to rule. However, those who should rule are the people who should not want to rule. They're the ones that could care less about ruling. They don't really want to rule. They're interested in other things. So then why is it that they're the ones that should rule? Why is it that we should think that the best rulers would be the ones who don't really want to rule? Well, according to Socrates, it is better to rule or to govern, even though one may not want to do so, than to be ruled by someone who is not cut out for the job, right? So think about it like this. It's better for the philosopher king to rule, even though they don't want to, than to be ruled by like a mechanic or a plumber, someone who's not trained for the position of ruling and governing a society. Think about someone like Donald Trump, who has literally no experience whatsoever in politics. And in fact, you might even think he's not a very good business person, right? So you might say that the philosopher king would prefer to rule, even though they don't want to, rather than to be ruled by someone like Donald Trump. That's just a sort of illustration to make the point that Socrates is getting at here. In fact, we're given an analogy that's really quite famous. This is the captain of a ship or the notion of the ship of state. And this analogy is supposed to show us why it is that the philosophers should be kings rather than someone who's not educated in that sort of job, that sort of role. So the way the analogy goes is as follows. We want the captain of a ship to be well educated and trained in the job of sailing, of seafaring, right? We don't want a captain to be someone who has no experience whatsoever in the job of sailing a ship or seafaring, right? In fact, it would be disastrous to have a captain who doesn't know anything about sailing or seafaring. If we had a captain who doesn't know what it is, what it takes to sail a ship, then that would cause problems. And so, likewise, we would want someone to govern a city who is well trained in that position. We don't want someone to govern a city who has no experience, education, or training in that sort of job. Again, we can compare this to a democracy where uneducated people can govern and or get elected, right? So oftentimes it's the case that non-educated people have the ability to run for office and get elected. Likewise, in a democracy as our own in the United States, it doesn't really require any education to vote for people. So it is very common for people to vote for issues that they have no understanding or education on. That's why it's very common for people to argue that we ought to make a well-informed decision about who we elect for political positions. And this goes back to Plato's Republic. It goes back to this notion of the ship of state. But in the time of Plato, this was a very, very radical position, right? Glaucon claims that Socrates' ideas are simply far too revolutionary to ever be taken seriously. However, Socrates argues that until kings begin to philosophize and philosophers become kings, then there will be no rest, no peace, no justice. So then who are the true guardians? Well, it's pretty clear that the true guardians are the philosophers. They're the philosopher kings. They are the ones that have been well trained and educated on how to govern, how to rule over a city. And it's at this point in the dialogue of the Republic that we are introduced into what's called the theory of forms. This is Plato's theory of forms that is introduced by Socrates. Following this video, I want you to watch another one on what exactly Plato's theory of forms is. But at this point, I want you to just pay attention to the distinction between belief on the one hand and knowledge on the other hand. It's this distinction between belief and true knowledge that's going to be crucial for how we should understand philosopher kings. Philosopher kings don't have mere belief, they have true knowledge. Whereas the non-philosophers have mere belief. They don't have true knowledge, true understanding, if you will. And the reason why is because they don't have access to the forms. Only the philosophers have access to the forms, and the forms give us true knowledge. And so that's why the philosopher kings are well educated to rule over the city, because they are the ones that have true knowledge. They are the ones that have been trained to understand the forms. Things like the form of justice, the form of truth, the form of goodness, the form of beauty. These are the things, these are the requirements for education on how to govern the city. So in the next video, I want you to pay attention to the theory of the forms as it relates to this issue. But now let's turn our attention to book 6. Again, philosophers have knowledge of what's real, true knowledge, true understanding of what justice is, of what goodness and beauty and truth are, right? So philosophers are the ones that should rule because they are the ones that have access to the forms of justice, the forms of truth and beauty and knowledge. Non-philosophers only have belief in what appears to be real. They don't have access to what really is real. And so it's only those who have true knowledge that should rule the just society, according to Socrates and Plato. Only the philosophers have true knowledge. They have knowledge of what justice is. They have knowledge of the good. They have what it takes. They are educated and trained to rule. And so it's only the philosophers who should be kings. Another way of putting that is it's the philosopher kings who should rule the just society. And it's in that regard, then, that we can think of the just society as being one that's structured according to real truth, real knowledge, reason, and rationality, and things of this sort. All right, then what we're going to do in the following videos is you're going to take a look at Plato's theory of the forms as it relates to the allegory of the cave, right? And then you're going to consider why the philosophers must go back down to teach the citizens, right? Remember, that's the way that the Republic began. It said, I went down, right? So that's the idea of the philosophers coming out of the Platonic realm of the forms in order to rule over and to govern the citizens of the just society. And then we need to think about why the just soul must be ruled by reason, right? So just like how the just city is divided into three parts, Plato thinks that the soul also has three parts. There's the appetitive part, the sort of the part of the emotions, the part that gets angry, the part that oftentimes causes us trouble. Then there's the spirited part, the part that wants to go to war, maybe the part that wants to, get in a fight with someone. And then there's the rational part of the soul, the part that's supposed to steer and guide the rest of the parts of the soul, right? So Plato thinks that the soul should be governed by reason and rationality. Indeed, it's only once we have a soul that's governed by reason and rationality that we can say that we've actually got a just soul, a just psyche, right? And so that's why the soul is important for Plato's understanding of justice. Just like how the just city, the perfect idealized city, must be governed by philosopher kings, those who have access to the forms, those who can be said to be truly rational, truly be using their reason, their intellect. Well, in the same way, the soul must be governed by the rational part, right? The part that has the correct understanding of truth, beauty, justice, and things of this sort. And then finally, I want you to pay attention to a video on how Martin Luther King's view of love and nonviolence needs to be understood in terms of reason and rationality, as well as education, proper education. And what that's going to do is it's going to lead us to a discussion of Dr. King's view of economic justice. Dr. King's view is oftentimes described as creating a just world where we don't see color, where everybody is equal, and you're not looking at anybody by the color of their skin, but by their merits, by the merit of their character, right? But that's only one dimension of King's view. But to get an adequate understanding of Dr. King's view, we need to look at his view of economic justice as it relates to proper education, proper rationality, and how reason and rationality is what's supposed to govern a just city. And so these are the issues that we'll address in the following videos.